Hello and welcome to today's SCI webcast, Trust, Verify, Authorize with DevSecOps. My name is Hasan Yasar. I'm a technical director here at SCI. And today I'm joined by Eric Bram. And Eric, please introduce yourself and what you do in SCI. What's your roles?
Thanks, Hasan. Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Bram. I work for the Cyber Workforce Development Team at CERT under SCI. I'm primarily a DevOps engineer, but also a software developer. I've been developing software for about 10 years now, with the focus on DevOps the past 2 years or so.
Eric, I'm glad to have you here. So since you are doing a really actual DevOps work, DevSecOps work, and plus with the secret experience, so we're going to have a great discussion today. So before starting our session, I would like to cover up some logistics items. And as I said, this is a DevOps tool. So I really would like to have interactive as possible from our audience. So if you have any questions, and on your YouTube channel on the right-hand side, you will see a chat window. Please put your questions over there, and then I'll try to take a look as much as possible, answer your questions, so we can get throughout our sessions as well. As I said, this is a DevOps way, and we can have all interactions together as much as possible. With that, and I would like to make sure that you guys are safe and healthy. I know this is really an interesting situation we are in, and I wish everybody safe and healthy in the situation. So before diving into our talk today, so we're going to cover up a couple items in our talk, which is how we build up a trust and how you build up to verify and eventually can authorize your systems that you're developing through DevOps and DevSecOps. So it's really a general problem in almost every organization that we are in. Like maybe you're following some specific guidance as through the ITO, or you're covering up other specific topics as based on some other work that you're doing it. So technically we are looking for to have and how we get a system approval, system authorizations throughout the life cycle. So before starting that our deep dive, and really I would like to hear from you, Eric, and what is your DevOps and DevSecOps and thoughts in your experience? Like, what is the roles and responsibility that you have seen so far in your work?
So originally, when I started doing this, I didn't even know I was actually doing DevOps, to be honest. Way back in like 2005 or so, we had cruisecontrol.net running for our .NET application. And really, back then, the idea was a simple build and test pipeline. That's kind of as far as it got. Later on in that same application, we started learning how to do actual CI tools with building and deploying the software, not just building and scanning and running unit tests. So that's kind of how I got to start in. And I personally love the idea of making something work through technology and automatically. I think that's really fun and really interesting to do. And it just helps out everyone else as well. It's a way to enable other people in an organization to function as efficiently as possible. So that's kind of where my experience lied in that. More recently, I've been doing the same type of DevOps work, but for the DoD, which has its own challenges. So some of this involves both the ATO process that Hasan had mentioned, and implementing and ensuring the continuous functionality of all the tools related to the DevSecOps process.
Yeah, it's a good stuff. Like I like the one thing you said, Eric, and you were doing some work as a DevOps, but you don't know what you're doing it because you are following other tools and process practices. I am sure when you use a lot of tools and practice with respect to the automations and deployments with your business needs, and you see suddenly a security looks like a bottleneck, right? Like how you improve your systems. So do you see that type of bottleneck problem in your organization that you have been seeing it, or based on your experience, like how really security folks is becoming a bottleneck for you and you would like to deploy quickly, you would like to deliver something quickly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's that continuous challenge, right? There is the idea of building secure code and building code quickly. They traditionally were thought to be in opposition of each other, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. But again, that comes back to the proper practices, procedures, and just the culture in general, which is something that was talked about in last week's webcast. But the idea is, yeah, I mean, security itself can be a bottleneck in releasing if you're not planning that through the application lifecycle. But depending on cultural buy-in, which you need to have, right, leadership buy-in, as well as the security tools themselves, I think that you can help mitigate a lot of those bottlenecks down the road as long as you're considering that process throughout the entire application lifecycle. But yeah, I have seen that bottleneck, and often it does actually present challenges to follow proper DevOps practices and procedures while also trying to mitigate some of the bottleneck issues, which is hopefully something we can elaborate more on a little bit today.
That's really, I would like to open up that the bottleneck problem when we look at with how we build up that trust. I think the biggest things in the bottleneck is, especially for the cultural elements. And when you talk about the culture, it is how we're going to build a trust relationship between the developers and architects, and mainly for authorizing officials. So let's talk about a little bit ATO process. I'm going to talk, and you said you have a DoD experience in the work you have done it. So in DoD, and we are following up the guidance from the risk management framework. The risk management framework, basically 800-37, based on the risk management framework, and so authorizing officials and follow up the risk guidance 837 and plus 801-37, which is kind of continuous monitoring aspect of it. So based on the RMF, we would like to see the connection between the lifecycle phases and application lifecycle and how each of the controls will be mapped into the lifecycle perspective. So I'm going to open up a little bit RMF so we can deep dive and try to map those requirements that RMF is asking from us and how we can get into the software lifecycle. So RMF is basically based on the 6 steps. And then first step is categorizing information system and information process stored and transmitted in the systems based on the impact analysis. Like if I am building something that is kind of maybe a system, maybe like some software, literally find out what is the information security policies we have to be in, which is requiring a direct communications with other stakeholders as well. And the second step is kind of selecting controls will be applicable for application stack, then implement, which is the development phases, and implement all the controls, then assess the implementation details. So we're going to talk about how we verify it as well. So basically, categorize, select, implement, assess, and authorize, then monitor. It's a kind of ongoing process. That's the really important to see how we can be connection to RMF with respect to the DevSecOps. And giving your experience in Eric and DevOps and DevSecOps, do you see that the direct connectivities because of RMF is asking about the continuation, kind of iterative loop based on the controls, based on system connectivities? So what do you see and to have a connection between all these components with the DevSecOps and environment? So we maybe can start from learning pieces first, because we're not expecting everybody knows everything with the controls, right, Eric? Like you are a developer and you work as a security engineer, and how do you really build up the relationship with respect to controls? Like the learning the specific controllers, learning specific vulnerabilities or specific security practices with respect to the code and architect as well. What do you think that, what type of things you have been seeing experience, Eric?
Yeah, that was there's a lot to unpack there, but I definitely have some comments on that. So first of all, I'm a big proponent of education. I think that will solve a lot of the issues that a lot of developers see as far as what kind of controls need to be met. As we know in our field, there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of people moving around, and I think that's great. You need to kind of vary the experience that people are getting, get their perspective from different angles. I know me personally, moving around between DevOps and software development, I feel like I can contribute a lot more in the DevOps field with the background that I have in security, or the background that I have in coding, as well as, like I just mentioned, security. So being a DevOps engineer, I can give the security folks some of my input on knowing exactly how an environment might be created, how the tools are scanning. But that's kind of going down a little bit of rabbit hole there. To answer your question, I think that education and communication are obviously vital in this aspect. Throughout the entire life cycle that you mentioned, Hasan, where we're creating an architecture, we're developing it, we're deploying it, we're monitoring it. The idea is it's only as good as the people that are creating and monitoring and maintaining it. If the tools are great but they're not implemented properly or the results aren't getting viewed, it's not really doing anything, right? So the idea is you need to make sure that your people are on the same page, they're all being educated properly, and that they're bought into the development process in the DevOps lifecycle. One other thing I'd like to note on that is just as they're buying into this DevOps and DevSecOps process, they need to understand the vision, what they're actually trying to accomplish. It's great that someone gets really excited about, a Kubernetes cluster or the latest scanning tool, but that's not really helpful if you're just doing tech for tech's sake. I know that's something that some people don't like to hear, but really, at the end of the day, your organization, or at least your application, should have its own vision, and you should be bought in. You should really feel that and have that resonate within you. And if you understand that vision, you can always step back and reassess what you're doing, reassess each of the cycles that you just mentioned, Hasan, in the DevSecOps process to make sure you're actually meeting the needs of the customer, and doing that through a DevSecOps process rather than just completing steps for the steps' sake.
It's a good point, I think, Eric, you brought up. So I'm going to open up the learning piece a little bit, and I'm teaching at the CMU, and a lot of my students, they don't know in the security basics as well, because that's how they are getting from undergrad school. So like learning is a really crucial element, and explain the what needs to be done with respect to specific controller that you're talking about. So one thing maybe you can open up more and discuss, and how we build up the learning is basic learning, a lot of sharing, right? Sharing with your experience and sharing the specific vulnerabilities and on the software that you're building. And also that depends on the software tech stacks. You may have a different type of coding practices, such as writing a code under C++ is different than writing code in the Python or the Django framework, right? So learning the best practices depends on technology you have. And also we may using a lot of tools and techniques as well. And all tools and techniques really telling us what needs to be done with respect to the coding practices, like building the knowledge pieces as we go along and tie into the business respect as well. So I'm going to go back to a little bit to RMF so we can continue, Eric. And RMF is based on NIST standardization. I forgot to say at the beginning, NIST 800-37. NIST is the standardization organization that built up RMF framework. And I looked at specifically in RMF, and 800-37 says the common principles to implement the continuous process of trust and then verify, authorize, which is kind of implementing overall process. You have to have a continuous monitoring process throughout the life cycle. You have the automation throughout the life cycle. Like automation means from every aspect of it, and how we get issue tracking systems, how we build up continuous integration, and how we build up the test cases, etc. That has to be part of the system development life cycle. It is not just only integration pieces as well. And then also should be monitoring throughout the life cycle that we said at the beginning. And also should be every level of the organizational aspect of which is kind of like learning pieces. It is requiring to have organizational culture, organization dependencies should be in place as well. And then most likely everybody should be responsible, accountable. Like you're a developer, you're a system engineer, or a security engineer, should be developer and also accountable for any breaches in an environment. So since you are doing a lot of work, Eric, in the development phases, maybe we can open up to what are the typical developers what they should do to get a trust relationship with the security officers. Like usually, based on my experience, what I have been seeing, Eric, like developer, they don't like the security folks for many reasons. And same thing, security folks, they don't like the developer for many reasons because of getting so much code is changing, so much dependencies are changing. What is your take on it for as a development perspective, as a developers? Put yourself in a situation, maybe I can play a security role. Let's see what are the frictions between developer and then security folks they have.
Right, I think that's a great question, and hopefully we're going to get to the point at some point here where the idea that the security folks and the development folks are not, necessarily at odds with each other. The traditional complaint of, a developer is just saying that the security team is holding them back. One of the things that resonated a lot with me recently was the idea of a shared goal. It's not so much that the security people are holding you back as a developer. It's more that the security people are helping you maintain an application that will exist as long as possible, as long as the application is relevant, right? If you're an application developer and there's a major breach, that could, depending on your organization, either bankrupt you, possibly get people hurt or killed, depending on the application. That is a big deal and something that you need to focus on, the big picture. And so the idea is you're trying to build this empathy between the development team and the security team, not because one is asking the other to potentially do some extra work or do some different work, or even hold back an application from going to production, which is, a scary thing to a developer. Instead, focus on the fact that a security team is helping a developer keep an application in production, keep it meeting the customer needs. And at the end of the day, that's the goal, right? It's not necessarily getting a feature to production is great, but meeting the needs of the customer, whether they're specified precisely or implied, meaning keep data safe, keep application security safe. At the end of the day, you're building that empathy by reaching a shared similar goal amongst the team.
Actually, the good point, we are saying the DevOps is the shared business goals, shared the same missions, shared an objective of the business. And what you describe is the security teams also part of the same mission as well. They're not separate from the team. Like first things we can count, and security team should be part of our discussions, our daily meetings probably if possible, or maybe sharing the same collaboration, same communication portal as well. So be part of like you're saying, the developers get the security folks into our team and sharing some same environments, like basically building a trust by sharing what we have and what things we are building, what type of tools and techniques we are using it, what our dependencies are, so we can understand, build up that relationship right beginning of the building the team cultures. So more specifically, another thing is important what I have been seeing so far, Eric, and getting a security settings into the code review process, because we do a lot of code review as a developers, right? We are looking for an architectural, the compliances in the code. We are looking for code style. We look for functionalities. The first effective one, and I believe, is having a security-based code review, and then having looking for and how we are writing, and with respect to the buffer overflow, an example, with respect to how we are handling the authentication, authorization pieces throughout the login processes as well. And then as a developer, sometimes we don't know, right? We don't know what we have to do because we are focusing more technical stack of the work. We don't know what we were going to do specifically an organizational security postures or the authentication pieces, and we can look into it. Did you see an experience and specifically in the code review, like effectiveness of looking for a security analysis or the security practices with respect to code review, Eric?
So I definitely think there's a great place for code reviews in this life cycle. I don't necessarily know if that is exactly the use case that I would think of as far as meeting those type of needs. One of the things that you kind of brought up, Hasan, that makes me kind of triggered something in my head was the idea of more of like an architecture diagram, something along the lines of describing your application, the environment that it'll be in, the necessarily dependencies that application will have. I think having an architecture diagram and being able to, for instance, populate backlog items for the development team regarding that architecture is going to be a lot more helpful than just reviewing specific code. Like you mentioned, it is great, and don't get me wrong, I think that is a necessary step. But if you're talking about implementing specific security controls, I don't necessarily know that is enough. I think having an assessment of the system as a whole is a great way to go back and ensure that you're actually meeting some security needs on the bigger picture. For instance, if you have a database, are you locking that down properly? Maybe looking at a feature change or a feature request in a GitHub repo, something like that, isn't necessarily going to provide the same context to the team as an initial plan of action and architecture diagram would.
Yep. Actually, I know it's not enough, but when we try to shift left the security to all the way to the beginning of the life cycle, and we said what RMF is specifically says has to be part of the life cycle. Like the life cycle has the planning sessions and which is kind of requirements and an architecture, design, development, test, and deploy phases, right? So usually we look as the continuous integration phases, which are using a static analysis tools. We have to have it, we are using it. But idea is how can the shift left to the security analysis? It is done through the integration phases, bringing to the level of developer are really writing a code in the IDE environments. Like if I'm writing a code and then on my IDE using maybe IntelliJ or Eclipse, whatever the IDE we're using it, how can we get a response and based on the code we are writing and automatically giving a recommendation and using a SQL injection corrections, probably maybe initializing variables as an example, maybe and giving a recommendation based on the how we are handling the creating an object as an example, or how we are really doing the encryption as an example. So there are many examples can be done as during the code review process because, and based on what I believe and what I kind of, and most of the industry folks are believing as well, so vulnerable is based on the defect, and defect is based on the flaw and also the bug in the systems. So if we are trying to eliminate any type of defect in the systems, that means we have to have a good design, or we have to have a fixing all the bugs in the system. So statistically, by having a 50% of each of the elements, either having a better design or having a better addressing the bugs in the systems, and then we can build up a secure system eventually, that we can start from the code review, that we can really do the work based on what we said at the beginning and based on the controls that we have. So kind of like creating a connection between the dots, like what we said at the beginning that we are trying to build up, and then we list the controls that we're supposed to do for the controls. And then as a developers, we are working the code and we can implement the code specific that we said at the beginning. So I'm going to open up this one, Eric, specifically, that kind of connect the dots. And do you have any experience? I'm sure you have, like using the issue tracking system in an example. As a developer, so typically you're writing your case against the feature you're writing. And what do you think about adding a security features into your issue tracking or case management systems and tie together? As a developer, you know what to do with respect to security. As a developer, you know what type of testings you will do with respect to security. Then you can do early security analysis and work and based on your life cycle. Did you have an experience like how you connect the work with the security requirements and put in the case management system?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point, and that's something we definitely need to hit on here is just how this process exactly works, right? So first of all, yeah, I think like you mentioned, there are a lot of tools that can integrate directly into different IDEs that will actually provide immediate feedback as you're developing a feature, exactly the kind of things like you were mentioning, Hasan, like simple buffer overflows and whatnot, checks that can happen prior to even committing your code. From there, you could also look at in your CI process, you might have some scans running against some branches that aren't going to production. You might, depending on your branching strategy, you might have like a development and a staging branch where maybe additional tests are run during commits to those branches. And those might get reviewed by, they might get scanned by different types of scanning tools, which we'll probably talk about later, the types of scanning. But that's one way to get feedback. So initially you might get feedback in your IDE, and that's using a tool, which is great. You might be getting subsequent security scans that aren't integrated into your IDE a little bit later. Again, we're trying to shift left as far as we can, but in some cases the tools just aren't there yet. So you might be getting some scanning in some of the development branches in your application. But going back to what you said, the idea that I mentioned with the architecture diagram is that depending on the application you're developing, you'll probably get some items pushed. Preferably, if you have this integration set up, you would be getting some of these items pushed directly to your backlog as a development team based on the choices you've made in your application. And from there, you could be implementing some of these security policies and procedures that you might not have otherwise known about. And some of them might be specific code implementations, like you might need to implement HTTPS across if you're doing any kind of communication. That might be a backlog item that requires specific code changes. Other ones might just be best practices that end up in your backlog. They might say, don't store passwords in your code in plain text. And those are ways just to educate the team. Not all developers have the same experience, the same background, the same knowledge. So it's a way to help level the playing field and get everyone on the same page as to maybe some good policies and procedures that can enhance the security of the application.
So like you basically cover up like how as a developers we are covering up and at the beginning and training using that kind of like a issue tracking system as a case and train our team members what needs to be done. And you also mentioned about the testings as well. I'm going to open up the more testing discussion. Like this is the first step. We build it, a relationship, and we are verifying what we are supposed to do. So verification is based on the test, right? We would like to do. So the test can be a many type of tests we can do, like unit testing, static analysis testing. And what your experience on the testing, Eric? Can you open up the more testing so we can dive and generate some result in the testing that can lead into the kind of verification phases or the authorization phases?
Yeah, definitely. That's something I'm really passionate about. So I think, again, a lot of these are probably going to be familiar to a lot of application developers, but it's good to go over, right? So at the most general level, you'll be doing some unit testing, which is just a small level, normally like a function or something that you're going to be writing repeatable tests for. Those are going to be great for things like regression testing as well, where as your application changes over time, you want to make sure you're not introducing any bugs into the old code. From there, you might have some end-to-end tests, also known as integration tests, where you can't necessarily test a single feature with one unit test, but you might be testing the communication between multiple pieces of your application, and that's where integration testing comes in. So you'll have these tests, and you're probably in your DevSecOps process, you're going to want to just make sure the check being that all these tests pass, right? But that's not good enough, right? We got to go into security as well. So you'll be looking at static analysis tools. A lot of those are going to go back again to your old school idea of, buffer overflows and that kind of thing, null objects and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we want to be testing as many vectors as we can. So it is great to have those static analysis tools that are necessary, but they're not adequate enough to solve the entire problem. So some of the other things we'd be looking at would be some third-party library tools where we're ensuring that, for instance, if you have like a UI web application, it's going to have a bunch of NPM libraries, right? That's like pretty much par for the course now. You have to have that. But a lot of these libraries that are public are also vulnerable, especially ones that are out of date. So you're going to have some tools that are also checking to make sure that the libraries your application depends on are also free of vulnerabilities. So you're going to be scanning the dependency tree of an application. You're going to be doing the static analysis. And preferably, you would also be doing some type of dynamic analysis. Again, I'm not a security engineer. I am the DevSecOps person. So I'm a person that would be helping to implement these tools and working closely with the security engineers in order to provide them the results. But that being said, I would say that the dynamic scanning part is also really critical. I mean, just think about it for a second. You could have an application that doesn't have any old libraries, doesn't have any static vulnerabilities, but it maintains some sensitive data, and you've never implemented any permissions or authorization for the application. So as soon as it goes to production, everyone can view everything, right? That's not going to show up necessarily in static analysis, but it definitely would in dynamic. And as well as configuration, as we move to a world that, applications are all microservices now, configuration management is a huge deal. It's very difficult to do. And I think that having these dynamic scanning tools is just one more step in kind of a myriad of solutions that can help us be more secure, just to kind of give a sanity check as to what's actually running, not just what the code looks like at rest. And the idea being we have all these things, maybe even like pen testing and whatnot. We want to get as many different attack vectors addressed as possible, and I think that's what's going to lead to the best application security.
Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to go back to the testing again, and that's really a big question I have been hearing. And with a lot of static analysis that we have to do, which is part of that continuous integration phases in DevSecOps environment, maybe using a Jenkins, maybe using other type of integration server, and use the static analysis prior to the post build and during the build, and then after you can do the dynamic testing after the build process. So there are a lot of questions because some of the static analysis are generating so much false positive as an example. When you have so much false positive, and as a developer, you're a DevSecOps person, do you feel that comfortably getting so many test results coming from your static analysis tools? And think about like you're writing a code, maybe not one engineer, you may have more than 10 engineers probably in your team members. Now with the DevSecOps perspective, which is when we are saying kind of connected all the tools and throughout the life cycle, connecting the testing, connecting test result. The big question go back to the result of static analysis. It is generating so much false positive, maybe generating so much alert. Do you see any difficulties to tie the alert to the actual code you're writing? And then depends on your dependency check, as you said, some of dependency check may not be a risk to the program you're building, an application you're building, because you're not using that dependency. It's part of your code problem, but you're not actively using it. It kind of comes together with other sub-dependencies. So what do you see that situation that alert says something you have to do, but either it's not applicable to the context that you're building, maybe it's not applicable to the controls has been selected. Did you have any type of experience, Eric?
Yeah, Hasan, I think that's a great point. That's something that I think plagues a lot of organizations is dealing with the false positives, right? It's, oh man, I got all these results back, but at the end of the day, you know, what if 90% of them come back false positives? And like you were mentioning, what does that do to the trust between security professionals and the development teams? Is that something where they see this more as a burden? It's not actually providing value if they're seeing all these false positives. So that is something that's a huge concern and something I think we need to do our best to address. I think a couple of things to go off of from that are, first of all, if this is, it's all scale, right? It's a matter of how much effort you can put into it. If you have a small dev team and a lot of security professionals, maybe the idea is that the security team will just handle it, and you know, it's no sweat off the developer's back if the security team is going through and assessing it. But really, I mean, I think what you want to do, right, is our goal here as DevSecOps engineers is to streamline the process as much as we can. So a potential solution there is if you see persistent results that are maybe not persistent results, but results that keep coming up, thematic results maybe of a certain type. Maybe one of the things you do is you work with your security professional and you change some of the rules, right? Like you can change the configuration of tools, or at the very least, you might mitigate. You might not mitigate, but you might customize the response that's get backs from the security tools to either a backlog or one of the things I want to mention a little bit later is talking about aggregation tools for the results. So again, that's not only providing you one view of all the security results, but it's providing you some, as a developer, it's providing you some information as to what the findings mean and how to mitigate them. So one of the things that you can work on as a DevSecOps engineer is actually to customize those messages to provide more feedback. And you know, honestly, maybe even if they are false positives, if a code change helps to mitigate that and maybe just clean up the code, even if it's not necessarily a vulnerability, that's never a bad thing. But at the end of the day, I think as a DevSecOps engineer, again, our duty is to make sure that applications are getting produced securely, deployed securely, and monitored. And I think that being able to customize these security tools and provide feedback, meaningful feedback to the developer is really heightening the bar for you know, exactly what we can do. Sure, we're still going to see some false positives, but if we can start to categorize what those false positives are, even specific to the domain of our application, we might be able to automatically verify that those are false positives and not bother the development team as much.
Actually, you said another point, and there was a questions, and I'm looking for the chat window as well. One of the questions was, how can we get the incremental and testing with respect to the cybersecurity? So as you said, like if you are building as the knowledge based on static analysis alert, the next time we already addressed that alert, and we don't want to look at it again because it has been addressed already. So, and also you mentioned about the dependencies. Another example, going back to the incremental release and incremental testings, we don't want to test the system every time for everything that we have done it. So like do the testing only incremental portion, that only the changes that has been done in the application lifecycle, such as if you are building a sprint as an example, like we are following up to probably 2-week sprint or 3-week sprint, and based on the sprint, what has been developed, what has been coded, just to test that pieces only and related to functionalities. So as you said, like we have a unit testings, we have integration testing, we have many other testings as well. Do the incremental testing and for the specific features has been an integration phases. The next time, and then keep out all the alerts that has been addressed already. So instead of going back and look at over and over and again, all the code has been generated, and have only the changes on the code and look at that static analysis pieces of the code incrementally the next time, and you can go to another version of it. Same thing is also true for the pen testings. Like in the pen testing is typically looking forward to the overall run applications. We should have it. Like there are, as we said, there are many testings to be done. And we don't want to stop the DevSecOps pipeline as well. We would like to continue. So to achieve the continuity, we have to really define the specific test scenarios for the feature that we are working on it. So when I say specific features that as a developer, as a team, are working in the product backlog, working in the based on the selected items from the backlog, which is part of the sprint, and do the testing only for the pieces eventually. Then every time when you have a new version, build it and test again for the feature that has been done. So before going back to the pen testing as an example, pen testing can be done specific to the application level as well. Like when you say application and specifically for the software feature has been done for the testing, then we can do the pen testing for the features only. We can do pen testing overall system as well down the road. So basically do more feature-based testings eventually, so we can build up and one by at a time. Then you have a continuous authorizations by adding a new capabilities and looking for the capabilities that you build it and test out. And the next time you already have a history for dependence as an example. So I'm going to deep dive into the for delivery problems as well. So we're going to talk, there's another questions in the chat window and asking about the metrics. So we're going to go to the metrics as well. So what are the problems, Eric, do you see in the deployment phases? Like when we deploy the code, and now we are deploying the code as automatically. That's what the DevSecOps, that's what we are saying as automation perspective. Maybe using a chef recipes, maybe using a salt stack, or maybe using a Docker, maybe other type of Ansible, whatever the Ansible, maybe other clip you're using it. But end of the day, you are deploying the code to the production environment, not a manual anymore. You're using a lot of scripts. Do you see any security problems, Eric, and deploy the code into the production environment or a staging environment? And how we address those problems as well?
Yeah, I'm really glad we got to this. This is actually something I've been interested in a lot recently. To start off, though, before I get into one of the pieces I'm passionate about, one of the things I wanted to bring up that you mentioned was the way that applications get deployed. And again, we are looking specifically at the DoD right now. So we're trying to talk about how those applications get deployed, and they come with additional requirements, right? So traditionally, you might think of an application as being packaged in, a zip file or something, burned onto a CD, and deployed in some secure environment, right? And that has a lot of manual processes that have to happen between the burning of the CD. You might be copying that somewhere else where scanning happens. And then finally, some other mysterious person might be pushing this to an environment where you might not have any feedback on what actually happened. So I think the very first problem we need to address is how we can streamline at least that process a little bit. And one of the things that I've seen happen is, even if there's this air gap that's happening in a DoD scenario, one of the things that can happen is when a development team and its supporting groups such as the AO and whatnot approve an application to go to production, one of the things that could happen is, even though it still has an air gap, you could be pushing backlog items to an actual ops person that's going to do this deployment. And what I mean is, you might have your DevSecOps pipeline be making a story in a backlog for this operator, such that when this code is pushed to a specific location, wherever that may be, they are alerted to it. They will be the ones taking this, doing the burning, whatever, putting it and deploying it. But now you also have a record. You're losing that email requirement, that IM requirement to alert another group on this deployment strategy, you will now have an automation tool where not only are you eliminating that necessary manual communication, but now you're also tracking it, right? You can go back and see, okay, this deployment is now in progress. This deployment was completed. When? Were there any comments? Were there any problems? It's just another way to monitor and track the deployment lifecycle in a confined environment. But that being said, I don't have a lot of experience with it yet, but there are different cloud providers that are starting to also work with the DoD. So that's something to just keep in mind. They're depending on the amount of regulations that get met with these cloud providers, there might be some opportunity there for a fully automated deployment, even in the case of some more secure environments. So that's something to keep a lookout for. That being said, one of the things that I'm really interested in and I'm excited to talk about is secret management. So like I mentioned, now a lot of our applications are going to be microservices, and they're each going to have their own configuration. But how do you make sure as a DevSecOps engineer that your applications are secure? And where do you draw that line? I mean, I think that's something that is very interesting. You not only now have an application that you have to keep secure and an infrastructure, which are the typical, old school ideas. But if you're deploying something in, say, Docker, you have the host and you have your Docker container, and are both of those secure? Do you trust secrets in Docker as a Docker secret? Do you trust the file system on a Docker swarm more than you would, an internal repo of having passwords? I think it's really interesting in how far you have to go, how far you want to go to make an application secure. I mean, it really depends, again, on your use case, but I think it's really interesting to see exactly what kind of solutions people come up with. Just to give some insight, I think one of the great things out there now are just if you're doing something in a Dockerized or a containerized environment, you have different secret stores that you can interface to. And the idea being that you're trying to keep as much of these sensitive secrets and sensitive information off of file systems as possible, where you have trusted clients that are connecting in with specific API tokens and whatnot that can all be generated and aren't hard-coded anywhere. I think it's really interesting, and hopefully we'll see more of that in the future, but I'd love to see where that goes and what people's opinions are on just how obfuscated the sensitive information needs to be. And not only that, but I don't want to go too far down this route, but how complex does that make your application? And is the additional complexity worth the gain you get for security, or does that introduce its own problems?
Eric, actually, interesting topic that you brought up for the secret management. That's another passion in my journey in DevSecOps. And since we are talking a lot of automation aspect of it, and I see the people like developers or DevSecOps or the organizations, we always like to use open source. We always like to use and grab from the GitHub as an example. And I did a quick search a couple of years ago, and actually we published a paper from IEEE too. We did a quick search on the GitHub for deployment scripts. Like deployment scripts can be more about like the connecting the dots, like how the secret management is handled in an environment, and such as like what you said, and for the information like passwords or the IDs. So when you look at the deployment scripts and the basic dependencies such as Django framework, one example, and such as the Redis Chef cookbooks or the manifestos from the Puppet. And then when I did a quick search on the GitHub environment, I saw so many open password was in a deployment file. It was really shocking to me, like seeing an open password in the deployment file, which is the developers are using the framework from Django framework or some other framework has password in it already. So we're not really looking for, we are saying it's trusted, we get it, but technically there's some open password. Forget other key management, just open password was, and it was shocking. So now, as the using automation, we had to be very smart and to how to manage the key perspective in our environment, so we can connect the keys in a secure place, and we use all the time. Like as you said, the many tools available, Chef or the Ansible, so many other tools has the mechanisms to handle the secret, handle the secret in the vault management, basically, that can be done as part of the deployment process. So we have to make sure that we are deploying an application securely, handling the key, and other things that you brought up. And having artifacts has to be in the same repositories, like how we are training the code as well. Like how are we going to get and make sure that the build is the right build running production environment. So we don't want to give anybody, either insider person or from any malicious people, that not change in the context of application production environment, which is creating a connectivity as well. It's really a great topic. We have to learn a lot, but thinking about DevOps perspective, it's really giving us a good capabilities for tracing the old artifacts, which version we are using it, and old artifacts, how we are storing repositories, either the code repositories, artifact repository, we can and have the versioning on it. So we have a full degree of assurances with the dependencies and also with the component in the lifecycle, including key management stored. So we have a full traceable of the component. That's really the reason that a lot of organizations are going forward to DevSecOps thinking, because it's bringing that capabilities, and with the integration concept, with the traceability concept, visibility concept, is bringing that capabilities as well very well. So let's continue the last pieces of our discussion today. We almost have 15 minutes, and at the same we have a couple of questions chat window too. And all the requirements in terms of the compliance perspective, legal requirements, same as for the ATO requirements as well, expecting some sort of authorization aspect, right? When we authorize it, and all these requirements, compliances are asking three things. So like I looked at the GDPR and looked at the FISMA, SOX, and HIPAA or PCI, or the requirements as basically requirements are in reporting what we have find out through the testing phases, or how we do address the bottleneck example, like a secret example. And then we have the audit, we have traceability. So basically DevSecOps is covering up traceability aspect of it. DevSecOps is covering up the reporting aspect of it, because we are generating the data. Data means like the test results, an example. Data means like a continuous integration as an example results, and sharing with the team members. And traceability is giving that capabilities. But to achieve the traceabilities reporting, we should have a good monitoring system, right? Like should be covering up our life cycle. We're not going to monitor just the production environment. We would like to monitor our life cycle. So what is your take on for the monitoring aspect of it? Like what things needs to be monitored, and how we're going to lay out the monitoring on top of our DevSecOps environment?
Yeah, I had a few comments on that. I'm not as familiar with some of the policies in the monitoring phase, but one of the key topics that I wanted to address in the monitoring was just the deployment frequency. I know that's something, Hasan, that you like to mention. One of the things that I found really interesting is just the idea of deployment frequency in risk mitigation. So the idea is if you're deploying, especially in a containerized environment, that's allowing you to deploy way more frequently than maybe traditional applications, especially if you're in a situation where you do have like a continuous ATO for the release cycle. So the idea being that if you're releasing more frequently, you're solving multiple problems at once. First of all, you're probably going to be releasing a base OS that's updated if it's in a container environment, meaning, if you're running an application on Linux, on a Linux OS or something, your base OS that you're building from is going to be updated, and that in itself might have some security vulnerabilities that have been patched. In addition to that, just consider the fact that you're actually building risk by not deploying. I know a lot of times as a developer, we tend to think, pushing to production is scary, right? We don't want to do it without being fully ready. We're nervous about what could happen, so we're pushing it off until our application is fully tested. But when does that actually happen, right? So I think at the end of the day, what you really want to be doing is you want to be deploying with as few code changes as possible, as frequently as possible. And just, it makes sense, right? If you think about it, when you're developing an application, you might be pushing to production, or pushing to development multiple times a day. As a DevSecOps engineer working with a development team, you might say, hey, our development environment went down because of X. You make the fix, and maybe someone doesn't log it, doesn't remember it. and when you go to push to production, 2 months later, you don't remember that, and now all of a sudden you might have a vulnerability due to a configuration change that you made in development that you forgot to make in staging. So you're building up risk by not pushing to production as often. If you're remembering to push to production every feature, or at the end of every sprint or something, what have you, depending on your schedule, you're lessening the amount of risk that you have built up. So I think that's one of the major things to take a note on there. But in addition, what you mentioned, Hasan, was the fact that there is this life cycle, and when it is a full cycle, so you need to decide when you're going to go back and maybe do a full reassessment. So one of the things that I'd like to think about is, when do you actually go back through? Like I mentioned earlier, at the inception of an application, you might be pushing a bunch of security tasks to the backlog. At that point in time, you have a specific dev team, right? But maybe in 6 months, in a year, that dev team has changed. You need to decide as an organization when you're going to go back and do an actual reassessment. Some popular things I've seen are on major product releases, also just time-based, like I said, maybe every 3, 6, 1 year. But the idea being, not only does the technology change, maybe you've added a database, or you've changed the database backend, but also the team itself changes. You might have lost some specific background context of an application, and with that person goes maybe some of the experience that you needed and that was being implemented by that person, that a new role isn't being filled. So the idea of a reassessment is part of the continuous monitoring, where you're going back through and you're ensuring that all the original goals are still being met.
It's a good point, Eric. Thank you. There was a question. I'm looking for the chat window. There are questions. Let's try to get these questions as well. So one of the questions was about the DORA metrics. So before that, what the DORA metrics means, like DORA is the DevOps Research and Assessment Organization. So DORA metrics has the 4 elements, like the mean time to recover, mean time to lead, and mean time to recovery, change failure, and deployment frequencies. So that's kind of like a generalize of the DevOps perspective. But I would like to, I'm going to come back to the question too, but in the typical data collection in the environment, we would like to collect as much as data possible. And what type of metrics we are using, that really depends on our organizational, depends on applications that we are using it. So like a common things, and on top of DORA, as the practicing, we have been advising and really find out what is the change failure rate as an example. And with respect to the ATO, and what's the time to approval, what's the time to patch vulnerabilities, it takes time. And because if you're not able to approve application, that will go to the production environment, and what is the duration of that approval process, because you finish up something is ready to go, but you don't have an approval yet. It is another metrics can be identified. A couple other things also I would like to talk about the metrics perspective, and then really would like to tie to our security posture. I know it's very hard into the other context because we have a segregated environments, but at least if you know the attack vectors we are dealing, and get our security monitoring attack vectors and try to represent in the developer context what needs to be done, and with respect to some dependencies, and with respect to some certain the attacks vectors, like maybe looking for cross-site scripting, maybe looking for SQL injection, what are the possible things we have been seeing in our environment, and then try to go and address in our lifecycle perspective as well. And how can we get into the application lifecycle, basically monitor our security postures and address and throughout the lifecycle and collecting right metrics, right data sets. And Eric, do you have any insight on what type of data has been collected based on your past experience that you were working on it?
So I think that's a great question. First of all, I really do, I wish that I had more metrics. That's something that I think I would like to focus on a lot more. I know I've seen a bunch of different logging, first of all, environment logging, application logging, and logging aggregators. I haven't investigated a lot of that myself, but I think that's going to be something, Hasan, that you know a lot more about and maybe you can speak to. But yeah, I think that like I mentioned earlier, there are different security aggregators. And what I mean by that are just different aggregation tools where the security scans will run and they will produce their results all in one place, where developers and the security engineers can go to look, monitor the results. Like you mentioned, as features come in, they can see the new scans and what vulnerabilities have been produced over time in each of the features. So that's one way that these applications are getting monitored over time, is through these security aggregators. But I don't know, Hasan, do you have any thoughts on different types of logging and monitoring that can be done over the DevSecOps lifecycle?
Actually, there are a lot of things can be done through DevSecOps because almost every tool is generating log files. So one is generating log files with respect to software development activities, who's changing the code, why we are changing the code, which is connecting our issue tracking system. So, and all these tools that we are using DevSecOps environment, build tools, planning tools are generating the log file. And then bring that log file and centralized place and monitor that, which is how we are doing the work. Second element is monitoring our building applications, such as monitoring how our Docker image is running in an environment, so we can capture any type of abnormal activities in a runtime environment in a container perspective. And then if you're using a container, and turn on the monitoring on the container and pipe the data, so we can monitor application, how applications behaving. Same thing is true for the Jenkins, and there was actually a great smart idea, by the way. The hackers, they were using a Jenkins environment as an agent, inserting malicious code into the Jenkins server and running a data mining behind the scene. It was a clever idea. I mean, I was shocked, and because now we are looking for a ready environment, ready platform all the time, and people are taking advantage of it, inserting some code into the Docker image, inserting code into our Jenkins environments, etc. So monitor all this component throughout the lifecycle, and then see any abnormal activity as an example. Then based on abnormal activities, you can define what needs to be done, and then visualize that components, visualize all the effect. Like, and other things, we have to really monitor our deployment script as well, how we are deploying the code. If we are monitoring our deployment scripts or the configuration management, we have an assurances in the configuration management perspective, and what has been changed, how we are handling the key management, and how we are carrying out from our deployment perspective, so we can collect that data. So there are many ways we can collect data, but the first element is we should have an integrated pipeline throughout the life cycle. Once we integrate the pipeline, we can insert any type of monitoring collection data sets, and then pipe the data from each tools and visualize it and share it and put the metrics on top of it as well. So there is another question in the chat window, and it was about, I know we are talking about the DevOps and DevSecOps. It looks like more developer-centric, and how the helping is the sustainment and programs. In the sustainment means which is more about the maintenance, more about supporting application in an environment. So it's not active development anymore, more about the maintenance mode. So in the definition of DevOps, an official definition, it's basically as including the not only production, and it is actually the maintenance and disposable of the life cycle of the application that we are building. So kind of like covering up from beginning to end. And we may not develop exactly, but in the sustainment environment, we are deploying application. And we are doing the continuous deployment. When you do the continuous deployment for any changes in sustainment environment, you need to have a platform to deploy it. You need to have practices of as a continuous delivery, as an example, to deploy that. So like to achieve any type of continuous updates in the process, we should have a good configuration management behind the scene. We should have a good continuous automation perspective behind the scene, so we can use the DevSecOps DevOps principle as part of our deployment pipeline. So we are top of the hours. Eric, before closing our today's session, do you have any go backs, any remark that you're going to call out as the kind of a quick takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah, I'd like to just give two real quick things here. I saw someone in chat mentioned if you don't have code changes, what do you push? I'm not sure if that got answered. I wasn't immediately watching, but sure. I mean, if you don't have your code changes to your application, again, like I mentioned, there might be third-party libraries that it got updated that you're pulling in. That might be something that gets updated, as well as, depending on your environment, you might be using Docker images or whatever container images that you're using that might have gotten updated. So it still is important to be updating your application, even if you don't have specific changes to your code base. So that's one of the things I want to mention. And then I just want to give a quick plug. I know we talk everything now is something as code. That's something that I think you should look for in your DevSecOps lifecycle as well. It's great to have a UI, but for change management, verification, and just overall usability as a DevSecOps person, I think you should be interested in looking to see if your DevSecOps process can be stored and processed as code as well.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thanks for everybody attending today's session. And please join us our next week webcast, and which will be the top 5 consideration before boarding the container ship by Aaron Wolfman and Dave Shepard. So the link register is in the chat area now and will be emailed as well. And for any questions, for any follow-ups for this event, for any question for DevSecOps thinking, please reach out to us at info@sci.cmu.edu. And also you can connect with us through LinkedIn and other platform as well. And thanks for joining us, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.